Well, welcome back. I hope you had a good week, and you were going to have a great weekend, I am sure. Today, we are going to look at widening inequalities of place, geographic inequalities, very important part of the puzzle. Now, remember, last week we looked at the effects of technological change and globalization on inequality in the United States and on widening inequality in the United States. One of the things we focused on particularly is that there is really an artificial distinction between globalization and technological change because technology is pushing globalization, and globalization is sort of pushing technological change, and they are interactive. I also stressed to you that there is globalization itself is a little bit confused in the public's mind and certain in public discourse because globalization is not just trade, it is also global finance and global direct investment by American companies, so-called, in the production capacities of other countries. In fact, global finance is really at the heart of much of what we see going on. And then we looked at the three job categories that have come to, well, they've been the dominant job categories for the last 120 years. But we can see that of those three dominant job categories, the category that I talked of as routine production work, whether it's manufacturing or even routine clerical work, all of that is declining quite dramatically because of improvements in technology. Everybody who was in manufacturing is being supplanted. A lot of the routine office functions are also being supplanted by first automation and now increasingly artificial intelligence. And then we looked at that second job category, which is personal services. That's growing. It's taking the place of a lot of those routine production jobs. But the problem is that for the non-college graduates, those jobs moving from routine production, which paid very well, many of those were unionized jobs, into those personal service jobs has been and has marked a decline in terms of income, again, particularly for the non-college. And then the third category was symbolic analytic jobs. Those are jobs that require a lot of problem definition, a lot of problem solving. And we saw that those jobs are also growing in number, but primarily college graduates, a lot of people who are also graduates of graduate schools and professional schools. And there is a geographic implication to all of this because as we saw, a lot of the symbolic analytic jobs, which are highly paid, given how much education and so forth is required, those are going to places like Silicon Valley and the West Coast and Seattle and Boston and New York, and lesser to a lesser degree around the rest of the nation, unless you have a major research university and a major international airport. Those are certainly critical components. But we see that much of the rest of the nation that used to depend on manufacturing or routine production has been emptied out of good jobs. The personal service jobs that remain are not very good. And then I suggested to you that there might be a connection here between all that has happened over the last 40 years in terms of what's happened to these job categories and politics, particularly with regard to the non-college voter, particularly white men without a college degree. We're going to come back to this, but now that we've started and kind of opened the door to geography, it seems only obviously that we look to widening inequalities of place, and depending upon sort of where you are geographically. So why is inequality widening depending upon where you live? And then the question is, who gets into my community? And I want to talk about the island. And some of you actually grew up on the island. You may not know it, but we'll explore the island in a minute. And then racial discrimination by place. There are very powerful and very important racial implications to where you are and how you got where you are, and educational sorting. I want to touch on that as well. And then finally, who gets into my quote unquote nation? Widening inequalities of place. Here we have a map of the United States, and you can see color-coded the places that are darker blue are quite prosperous. And you can see over here, the Bay Area, for example. Now, there is a lot of inequality. There's a lot of, obviously, poverty. But overall, relative to elsewhere in the country, the Bay Area is very, very prosperous. And we see the same thing with Seattle, and we see the same thing in Los Angeles. These are, as I talked about last week, symbolic analytic regions. There is a region of Colorado that also is doing quite well. Here we have the Salt Lake City area. And then look over here, again, New York and Washington and Boston, a little bit around Madison, Wisconsin, and Chicago. But you can see how uneven this is. The great areas of this country that have been almost emptied out of good jobs, you can see not just Northern Ohio, but also West Virginia. West Virginia is sort of interesting to me, given West Virginia's current senior senator. And then you also have Eastern Kentucky and Arkansas and a lot of poverty in Louisiana, Texas. Some of this poverty, particularly here in the West, is poverty that is indigenous people who are Native Americans. But the poverty here in Alabama, primarily it is Black people in Mississippi, not entirely. West Virginia, that poverty is mostly white people, very poor white people. But the major point I want to make is that there is regional variety here, a variation. Wealth and poverty is very much tied and correlated with geography. But one of the ironies is that geographic mobility is declining. Now, what you'd normally expect is that as populations become more mobile, and the United States population certainly has been mobile geographically for 200 years at least. I mean, it's been moving, the white population has been moving west. The Black population, beginning with the Great Migration of 1910, started moving from the south to the north. You have, even before that, Native Americans who moved from the east to the west. Now, make sure you know that I know that you know that this was not entirely voluntary. These migrations are a combination of forced migrations, they're combinations of opportunity, but they also are necessity, sometimes economic necessity. Now, here's the interesting thing. Geographic mobility, given all of that, you would expect more mobility, but actually geographic mobility is declining over time. This graph shows us between 1947, after the Second World War, and 2019, the rate of Americans relocating actually started dropping. Now, footnote, that may be changing now because of the pandemic and the discovery by many people that they can work from home and they don't have to endure terrible commutes in very crowded parts of the country. Employers may also discover they don't have to pay huge rents. Maybe they are going to be moving too, but at least over the last 70 years, we see this pattern. And the first question for you today is, why is geographic mobility declining? Is it A, because people in low income areas don't want better jobs in high income areas because the cost of living in high income areas is becoming so high they would be worse off? Or is it B, people in high income areas don't want to move to low income areas, even though the cost of living is much lower there because there are so few good jobs there? Or is it C, people in low income areas are more dependent on webs of family and friends there for childcare and financial help, so they don't have that luxury of moving? Or D, people in high income areas are more dependent on webs of symbolic analysts there for ideas and insights, so they can't easily move. What do you think? Go. Okay, well, complicated question, and probably everybody is a little right because all of these factors are important. But let's see. Let's see what you say. Well, most of you think that it's A, that, and I can totally understand that because, after all, we are living in the Bay Area and the cost of living is very, very high. So low-income area is very, very hard. I mean, if you were in a low-income area, you sell, even if you have a house, you sell your house, you'll never be able to afford to live in a place like the Bay Area. And that's about 42% of you. But B, a lot of you also think it's people in high income areas don't want to move to low income areas because there's so few good jobs, at least good paying jobs. Undoubtedly true. But I want to just bring your attention and put major flags down on C and D because there's a lot of evidence, particularly evidence we have generated or we have seen that has been generated over the past 20 years of agglomeration. It's called agglomeration effects. That is, people in high income areas come to the high income area or are recruited to the Bay Area, for example, and companies stay in the Bay Area because there are so many other talented people or people with a lot of education, a lot of skills, and just rubbing up against them informally, seeing people. The informal sociology of symbolic analysts is a very important generator of value itself. And so one reason it's not all that easy for people or for firms, particularly high technology or Los Angeles entertainment or New York securities industry and financial industry, or wherever you want to see these agglomerations of high tech or symbolic analytic people, one reason they don't change is because of the agglomeration effects. The other thing I wanted to just put a flag on is the importance, and again, sociologists are seeing it more and more, these webs of family and friends, number C, become insurance policies. If your kid is sick, or if you get sick, or if you lose a job, and these webs in a geographic area of families and friends do provide a cushion against just bad things happening. And that cushion functions as the equivalent of an insurance policy. Again, more and more important as the social safety nets become more frayed. So I think C and D are important. I agree with most of you, and most of the data does suggest that A is the major factor, but I think maybe it's possible to understate or undervalue how important C and D actually are as well. Which gets us into this notion of who gets into my community. Who gets into my community? Let me again ask you, because one way of getting you to see this and understand it intuitively is to ask you, which would you prefer? Now, I'm going to give you a choice of you're looking for a place to live. You're shopping in effect for a community. And I want to give you the same square footage. So there's no difference in the amount of space you're buying, but I want to give you a choice. And choice A is a $150,000 condominium in a gated community. Now, the condo fees are $12,000 a year. There is no property tax, and you get private security guards. You get well-attended grounds. You get a private pool. You get recreation. Now, the thing is, poor families can't afford to live there because they can't qualify for a mortgage. They're just not good credit risks. And there's also a restriction on the size of the families, a maximum of 2 children, which rules out many larger families, many of which are poor. But I'd like you to keep A in mind. Just make a note of A, because I want to now contrast it with another choice you're going to have. B is $150,000 house in a city, $12,000 a year property tax. In other words, the cost is exactly the same. But here's the difference. It's public police, access to a public park, and a public pool. And the police are going to respond, as they can. The public park obviously has some homeless individuals living in it. There are occasional safety issues. Public pool is often crowded. It's noisy. So which is it, friends? And because you have the luxury of doing this honestly, anonymously, is it going to be A or B? Go. 55% of you say A, 44% say B. Let me ask anybody who voted or prefers B why you have chosen B. Anybody want to put up their hands and explain yourself? I mean, I can see why some of you choose A, because you get all these amenities, and you don't have to share them with people who are going to use up more of them. But how about you B people? Anybody?
Well, I chose B because A just sounds to me like thoroughly aesthetically and emotionally and culturally and unenjoyable. So, like having a private personal amenities, particularly at this point in my life, or even if I had children, I'd hate for them to be living in a gated community that was all of their access to any other like life is barred. That just sounds terrible and really bad for personal human development and not particularly fun. So I think B sounds a lot more enriching.
Enriching and fun, and therefore, because there's more variety.
Variety and like simple just exposure to the world around you, which I think is a really important thing and way to live.
Yeah. Well, anybody who voted and preferred, most of you preferred A, and I'd like to hear from somebody who preferred A, particularly in responding to point about variety and interest, and and kind of not just being bound by the gated community. So any of you overwhelming preference for A? Anybody wants to explain yourself?
Hello, Professor. So I was thinking for A, gated communities don't necessarily have to completely bar you from engaging with the community at large. So if I chose A, for example, I would still have my kids go to public school, hang out in public parks, engage with the community, and not be too confined. But in terms of like safety, I feel like that I'm living in an area with, private security and, well attended grounds and things like that that would be safer for small children because, you do your best, but you can kind of just let them run around and not have to worry about harm coming to them and, understaffed police or things like that. So,
Well, it's interesting. Thank you, and thank you both. But this is the kind of choice that Americans are making, and you can understand that behind this choice is both economics. That is, you get quote unquote more for your money if you choose A, because as you just said, you get private security guards, you get more safety, for example, than you would get with public police officers, and you get well-attended grounds and a private pool, and it just you emphasize safety. Somebody else might say, well, I just don't have to. Every dollar I put into this goes further in terms of my own and my family's own satisfaction. But there are other people who will say, no, I just want, I want the interest, the excitement, the variety that comes with being public. Now, the important thing here is that most of you chose A, and most Americans, given the option, and there is more and more of an option to, I'm going to use a loaded term, secede, are choosing the A route. And that A route is clearly dividing us not only by class, but also increasingly by race. Would you prefer to send your kids? Now, here's another similar but slightly different choice, and it's your kids. You have a private school that costs $16,000 a year and almost guarantees her a good education and subsequent access to higher education. Or B, an excellent public school in an upscale community with the same result. And because the school is so good, you pay an equivalent of $16,000 a year in the higher price for the house to get into that community. Or C, a public school in an average community that can give your child an average education, but it's only a good one if she works very, very hard. Which do you choose, A, B, or C? Go. Well, overwhelmingly, 68% of you like the idea of an excellent public school, in a very well off, upscale community. It's going to cost you the same as the private school because, to get into the community, you have to pay the equivalent of $16,000 a year and a higher price for the house there. But what's interesting, at least to me, is that A and B are actually the same. A is a private school, B is a private public school or a public private school. And by that, I simply mean that B is as exclusive as A in terms of class and race, or is likely to be as exclusive as A in terms of class and race. And the big difference is C. C is the outlier. But why did you choose B over A? Well, we don't quite have time to get your response. Maybe a response from one of you who chose B over A. Anybody?
I chose B because it's very much the school that I went to. So I went to high school in Atherton, which is an upscale community, but it was a public high school and it was underfunded in many senses, but it was an upscale community and it was the same people that went to the private schools in the same town. Like it was the same people, same level of wealth. Parents were equally educated. And like you said, like the result was the same in terms of like a lot of people from town going to college. And so I thought it was like perfectly fine. And I preferred it because you're around more diverse perspectives and it was less sheltered in that sense.
So, in other words, you preferred B because even though you say it was identical to A, it wasn't really identical. It was a little bit more diverse.
Yeah, it was.
Okay. But it was still in an upscale community, and presumably, my guess is that the reason you could go there is because the housing in Atherton, we're talking about Atherton, California?
Yeah. There were like 8 schools that fed into the one school. So I lived in a town next door. I didn't live in Atherton, but yeah, there are people from 8 different towns like Redwood City, Atherton, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, like a bunch of different towns.
Yeah, and most of those towns, I assume, in order to get into that school district, I mean, those towns are fairly expensive places to be. The point I want to make here is that we've got to be very careful not to fool ourselves into thinking that just because something is called public, like a public school, that it really is fundamentally different from private if the funding of that public whatever is dependent on basically a fairly exclusive and fairly expensive source of funding. I want to get into this more deeply because I just want to make sure you understand financing public schools because the states provide about half of school funding. But that other 45% comes from local tax revenue. And locales, as we segregate by income and by race, those locales have very different tax bases in terms of how much money they raise from the property tax. And that means that the quality of the school is going to be very, very different. A poor property tax base is going to mean that you're going to have a school that is much poorer. With 45% of your local revenue feeding into your schools, that's going to make a big, big difference. Now, California has managed to buck the tide a little bit. Local property taxes are still large, a large source of school funding, and there is still a lot of segregation by income in California, according to schools and communities, but the state provides a lot more. Why is that? It's really because the state's funding formula for schools, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but it's very complicated. Most people can't figure it out. In most states, it's very easy to know, and people say, I don't want my property taxes to be given to them, to their school, their community. It's for me, it's for my school, it's for my community. In California, the funding formula is so complicated that kind of, I don't want to give my property tax to them, is just too hard for people, frankly, to figure out. But it does raise a sort of fundamental question. I don't know how many of you, let me just, a show of hands. I'm going to ask you, and I want you to be very honest and show your hand. Anybody grew up or went to school in Piedmont, California? Any of you? Anybody showing? Just put up your hand if you went to school in Piedmont, California. Are there any Piedmont people there? I've been teaching this course for, I don't know, 12, 14 years. There is always somebody from Piedmont. Now, maybe you're just a lurking Piedmonter. Piedmont, the reason I ask this is because here's a map of Piedmont. This is, and I call it an island, because Piedmont, California is this island inside Oakland. Here is Oakland, California, and here's Piedmont. How did Piedmont become an island? Well, Piedmont became an island the way a lot of other places become islands. It's an island of privilege, mostly white, mostly higher income, in a sea of lack of privilege that is largely low income and also people of color. Just compare the two school districts, and this is the 2017-2018 school year. We didn't have more recent data, but it's probably similar. We're just looking at Oakland and Piedmont. Remember, Oakland is the sea around Piedmont. Piedmont is the island. The number of students enrolled in Oakland is 50,000. In Piedmont is 2,000. Percent Latino, Oakland is 41, almost 42%. In Piedmont, it is 3%. Percent African American, Black American, Oakland 25%. In Piedmont, on the island of Piedmont, it's 3%. People, the percent of English learners who do not come to school with English as the first language, 31% in Oakland, but on the island, 1%. Free or reduced price meal program. That is for families that are poor enough to qualify, which means that the children really do need help with regard to making sure they get 75% in Oakland, 2% on the island. And we could go down and look at teachers. 21% of teachers in Oakland are in their first or second year of teaching. They don't have very much experience. 3% in Piedmont are only in their first or second year. Most are more experienced. Look at teacher salaries. Oakland versus Piedmont. Piedmont pays more, highest salary in Oakland, highest salary in Piedmont. Not a huge difference, but I'll tell you something, there's a big difference in terms of being in a classroom. Because if you're in a typical classroom in Oakland, and I've been in many Oakland classrooms as an observer, a typical Oakland teacher is teaching many more students and is spending a lot of his or her time trying to maintain kind of security and quiet and make sure that these students, many of whom again are not native English speakers or come from poor backgrounds, or the kids haven't had sleep, because it's hard to get sleep when you're in Oakland. If there's a lot of noise around and sirens, if there's a lot of problems, you understand what I'm saying, that the teachers in the Oakland schools are doing harder work, generally speaking, than the teachers on the island. And then look at the performance in terms of the dropout rate. On the island, 15% of the kids in school are dropping out, 0.5% on the island. And we could go on and on and on in terms of well, you get my point. Basically, there are two different sets of opportunities. One is the island and one is Oakland. If you look at San Francisco, for example, you see the median housing prices and condo prices. Well, look at what's happened. I mean, compared to 1982, well, San Francisco, you can barely get a foothold in San Francisco. San Francisco is now a city that is impossible to afford unless you are quite well off, or unless you have parents who just sort of, or grandparents who gave you a house to live in. And yet it has a lot of poverty, a lot of homelessness on the streets. And then let's also look at another city just by contrast. And that other city is Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan, which is now almost entirely poor, very low housing costs, to be sure, but the water is dangerous to drink, and a lot of the residents of Flint, with some justification, feel like they are second or third class citizens. You know, years ago, many years ago, I'll tell you, it was 1964. I got a job in Flint, Michigan. I got a job as a radio disc jockey. I was just interested. I wanted to be, I don't know why I did it. I was 18. I wanted to be a radio disc jockey in Flint, Michigan. Don't ask me. But here was the thing. Flint, Michigan was then a thriving blue collar town. It had it had Buick, it had GM. It was a town that had a lot of good jobs, and it was growing and it was thriving, and it had a good tax base. It had good water, and there I was as a disc jockey. They gave me. I was young, so they gave me the midnight to 6 a.m. shift. And I could only play, I didn't know this when I took the job, the station policy was I could only play the top 10 songs. And well, that summer, the top 10 songs didn't change. They were, I Ain't Got No Satisfaction, Love, Sweet Love. Well, I could go through them, but I had to play them over and over. I got so bored that I decided that I would give somebody, anybody who called in, I said on the air, if you call in, I'm going to give you $10. Just call in, chat for a minute with me. I invented talk radio. Did you know that? So I said that on the radio. Just call in and we'll talk, and I'll give you $10. And nobody called in. And then I upped the ante. I said, well, $25. Call in. We'll talk. Nobody called in. I went up to $50. $50. There I was in Flint, Michigan, sitting in this little booth from midnight to 6 a.m. And suddenly I realized nobody was listening. My first existential crisis. All right, so San Francisco and Flint, Michigan, the point is that all over this country, we have wider and wider diversity as we segregate more and more by income, and also because income correlates with race, segregate where we live by race. When we say my neighborhood, or when we say my community, or my state, or my country, the pronoun is loaded because the pronoun my conveys a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. Their neighborhood, their community, my neighborhood, my community, my country, you see, those are what? Those are determined by what? Why do we assume that certain boundaries are defining of our own loyalties and our own willingness to share in the costs, like a school district? Let's take a look at Detroit and Oakland County, Michigan. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Detroit, and this is not a terribly good map. You'll just have to take my word for it. But here's Detroit. Here's downtown Detroit. Detroit is a very poor city. It's losing population, and you can't quite see it, but right here where I am pointing is a boundary line separating Oakland County from Detroit. So if you actually go out one of the main streets of Detroit, you don't know that you're going into Oakland County. The only reason you might know it is the houses and the quality of the buildings start getting much better, but you're still in the same geographic urban area. The reason I want to emphasize this is that this boundary between Oakland County and Detroit becomes enormously important. Oakland County, Michigan, is one of the most wealthiest counties in Michigan. It is a very high income area. Detroit is a low income area. Now, why is it that the taxpayers of Oakland County are not paying for the schools and the roads and all of the other needs of the people in Detroit? Because they are in a different county. Why are they in a different county? Because, well, that's what we're going to get to. You see, the boundary of Detroit is totally arbitrary. The boundary of Oakland versus Piedmont is completely arbitrary. Piedmont, Oakland, Detroit, Oakland County, various other places around this country, these boundaries define who is subsidizing whom and who is sharing the costs of what. Look at Alabama. This is right outside Birmingham, Alabama. Here are two towns, Gardendale and Trussville. Well, over the past few years, guess what happened? Gardendale seceded from the Jefferson County School District. This is the Jefferson County School District where everybody's property taxes were pooled to pay for schools. Well, Gardendale, a high income white area, and Trussville, a high income white suburb, both of them created their own school district, and their taxes only go to Gardendale and to Trussville. You get my point. These boundaries are politically determined. And as I started to say to you last week, we can't keep politics out of this discussion. It's not just economics. Orinda, California. Anybody here from Orinda? Now, certainly, I mean, I can understand you may not be from Piedmont, but Orinda, anybody from Orinda?
Yeah, I actually lived in Orinda, but I went to school in Moraga, which is like right next door.
Oh, and was that a pretty good school? Was that a public private school, or was that a private school, or a public school, or?
It was a public private high school, yeah.
Okay, so it was like Orinda.
Yeah, pretty much.
And Orinda, now Orinda, just explain for us because a lot of people may not know, but Orinda is it's a fairly expensive place to live.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of single family homes, lots of nature, which I really liked, but definitely not as diverse as I would have liked to grow up in.
And diverse, by diverse you mean both economically and racially and in terms of ethnicity?
Yeah, for sure.
Mostly white.
Mm-hmm.
So Orinda is a tax base. It has people in Orinda pay taxes. Has a school like Moraga, and the school is a pretty good school, right? I mean, that's why we are calling it a public-private school. Now, did you ever hear about Vivian?
No.
Oh, well, let me tell you about Vivian.
Okay.
Vivian, who's hiding behind a Justin Bieber doll. Vivian, age 7, she was determined by the Orinda School Board to be that her residence was not really Orinda. She said her residence, and her mother said her residence was Orinda, and she was attending the Orinda school. But what happened was that the board said, no, she's not in Orinda. She is in another town. She's in Bay Point. And that, it turns out Bay Point and the schools in Bay Point are nowhere near as good as the schools in Orinda. So Vivian and her mother wanted her to be in Orinda, but the school board did not want her to be in Orinda. Now, why did Vivian think she could be in Orinda? Because it turns out Vivian's mother was living in a house as a helper, a maid, for a wealthy family in Orinda. But the school board said, but you may be, living in that house, but it's not your house. Your house is in Bay Point. Why did this become a big fight? Because of the issues we are now talking about. The school board in Orinda wanted to guard the boundaries, wanted to make sure that any kids like Vivian who didn't fit, and by fit, I mean not just racially and ethnically, but also didn't fit economically, were not in the Orinda schools, because once you didn't guard that boundary, the school board feared, then there'd be no end to the number of poor kids from Bay Point and elsewhere who would try to sneak in to the Orinda schools. So with a boundary comes the necessity, according to the people like the school board, of guarding that boundary. By the way, Vivian, ultimately, she and Owen Biber, they did get into the Orinda school because this became such a public issue. The reason I just mentioned it is because this is a few years ago, but it became such a big issue that Orinda as a town was embarrassed by what they did to Vivian. But schools are doing it, and school boards are doing it all over America. Keep them out because of the pronoun test. Our school, our community. Vivian is them. Vivian belongs to their community. Vivian's not part of our community. Go to any major city and you see geographic, racial segregation that also parallels segregation by income. New York City, for example, the green dots are white people, the blue dots are black people, the orange dots are Latinx, Hispanic, and you see some Asian. And by the way, when we see these categorizations, this is only a matter of, again, I want to emphasize, these are distinctions that are created by cultural stereotypes. There is not a human genetic distinction. These are cultural artifacts, if you will, but they have huge consequences in terms of discrimination, in terms of people getting the jobs or getting the education they need and they want, in terms of where people live. And they are very arbitrary. Some of the data series, by the way, don't even include Asians. Some of you may wonder, well, why isn't Asian there? It's because the data series doesn't include it, or because the term Asian is such a huge catch-all for so many different backgrounds and nationalities and ethnicities that it is meaningless. Chicago. Again, we can see here are Black people concentrated in particular areas, not only school districts, but also locales with certain kinds of policing, certain kinds of amenities or lack of amenities. And here are Hispanic, Latinx people, and here are white people. And those white people do, particularly along the lake, tend to be pretty well off. So what's the major reason or explanation for racial segregation geographically? Is it A, just personal choices, like white flight? You know, Detroit, a lot of white people just left as Detroit began to get poorer and darker in terms of race. Well, a lot of white people just say, okay, we're going to over to Oakland County. Or is it B, differences in income and wealth? That is, white people who tend to be richer can afford to live in places with lower crime, better infrastructure, better schools. Black people who tend to be poor cannot. Or is it laws and regulations and the legacy of laws and regulations? Go. Well, 56% of you say laws and regulations, or the legacy of laws and regulations, and we're going to get into that. And although A and B are not wrong, the evidence suggests that laws and regulations backed by both personal choices and also economic choices may explain much more. And I want to take you to St. Louis, Missouri, and its suburbs, because just a few years ago, there was another kind of racial incident, a police shooting. You may remember in Ferguson, in St. Louis County. And I thought it would be a good way of getting into the subject of what historically we have done through laws, through politics, to exacerbate many of the geographic segregation issues we're now dealing with. And so if you go back to 1916 in the St. Louis area, St. Louis enacted an ordinance that barred Black people from buying, where 75% of the residents were white. And this is a typical advertisement. It's an actual photograph. Save your home, vote for segregation. Now, vote for segregation. That was the ordinance that barred Black people, where 75% of the residents were white. Why? Because the white people were scared that they would lose their property values. Nothing new here. There's also restrictive covenants. By that, I simply mean that when you sell your house, you, up until 1948, in various places around the country, had to put a clause in that deed that guaranteed that you would not be selling to somebody who was Black or Hispanic, Latinx, or Jewish. This is a typical covenant here. Well, this was the law up until 1948. The Supreme Court in Shelley v. Kramer found that this law was unconstitutional. That is, the courts would not enforce restrictive covenants. My parents bought the first house we ever lived in, the first house I ever remember living in 1947, just as Shelley v. Kramer was coming up to the Supreme Court. And there was a restrictive covenant. My parents were Jewish, and the people who sold to my parents violated, technically, the restrictive covenant that said you can't sell to Jewish people. And my parents didn't particularly like the community. The community was not very welcoming, but the house was very convenient in terms of my father had 2 clothing stores that he ran, and he wanted to live there. And my mother almost convinced him to leave until one day there was a group of people who came to the door, men, old men from the community. My father, in his naivete, thought they were a kind of a welcoming party. Actually, they weren't a welcoming party. They came into the house. My mother said, "Please come in." They came in and they said, "Mr. and Mrs. Reich, this is a community that is a Christian community, and we don't think you will be happy here. We suggest that you leave." Well, my father, who had not been very excited about, staying or leaving, my father decided at that moment that he was going to stay. Nothing was going to get him to leave that community. He dug his feet in, and I'll tell you, for the first 18 years of my life, that's where I grew up. Those old men, well, they were very unhappy. In the 1930s, the Works Projects Administration, this is the big infrastructure project of the Franklin D. Roosevelt New Deal, built segregated public housing. And again, we're going back to St. Louis. This is a work crew in St. Louis. You can see even the work crews were segregated. Mortgage loans were redlined in the sense, here's the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was in fact subsidized itself by the government, but this is Chicago. And what redlining essentially means is that if you are a Black person and you were seeking a mortgage loan, and there's no other way you can get buy a house, except by a mortgage loan, regardless of your race. Well, if you're a Black person trying to get a mortgage loan for an area that is redlined against Black people living there, well, then the banks are not going to give you a mortgage loan. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation is not going to help you through the banks get a mortgage loan. Redlining reinforced segregation. FHA, Federal Home Administration loans, loan guarantees on mortgages, available only for white neighborhoods. Again, this is the federal government reinforcing and encouraging, legitimizing, imposing racial segregation. In the 1950s, 1960s, we're back in St. Louis. This is a neighborhood, and I vaguely remembered it, but this neighborhood was it disappeared. It was razed. Urban renewal was the term, but it was not urban renewal. Urban renewal, in at least in St. Louis and many other cities, meant essentially taking a Black neighborhood and eliminating it. So there could be new downtown, new real estate. Federal highways cut through and fenced in Black neighborhoods, still do, so that the Black neighborhood was even more cut off from white neighborhoods, often more prosperous neighborhoods. And you can see the effects of how highways, just the decision of where to build a highway, had the effect of reinforcing segregation. Now, in 1968, there was passed a Fair Housing Act. What's the test for illegal discrimination? Well, developers would receive a lot of federal tax credits to build low-income housing. As states were deciding which projects were getting the tax credit. Now, what if the projects increased low-income housing but also increased segregation? In other words, you had more low-income housing, but the state, intentionally or unintentionally, did it in a way that increased geographic racial segregation. What about that? Well, in a 2015 Supreme Court case, Texas Department of Community Affairs versus Inclusive Community Project, the Supreme Court ruled that policies that have the effect of increasing racial segregation violated the Fair Housing Act of 1968, even if there was no evidence of intent to increase racial segregation. A very important Supreme Court decision, because it's easy to show effect. It's hard to show intent. There were housing and urban development rules. This was issued under the Obama administration. It required local governments to identify illegal patterns of racial segregation and create detailed plans to remedy them. And local governments receiving federal housing had to end barriers such as exclusionary zoning. Now, when I say exclusionary zoning, I mean zoning that makes it very difficult for poor people, disproportionately Black or Latinx, to get into those communities, either because the zoning says houses have got to be gigantic, or they've got to have only 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, so you can't really have a large family, or whatever other ways the zoning laws were used, and they are used, they're still used, indirectly to have an impact that segregates by race and by income. You see, the legacy of discrimination by race. What is the legacy? Well, there are a lot of inferior public services. If you're in a town that has basically become poor, and again, because it's poor, it's disproportionately likely to be Black and often Latinx. So you don't get the schools you want, or good schools, streetlights, police, social workers, firefighters, healthcare workers, sanitation, sidewalks are in disrepair. You don't have the parks or playgrounds. Public transportation is not good or up to snuff. You see all of the ways in which inferior public services follow from low tax bases and unresponsive local governments. And in the case of Flint, Michigan, you don't even get clean water. There is also the legacy of the racial gap in the financial return to home ownership. And what you see here is the return. That is, for every dollar you put into buying a house, what kind of return do you get? Well, it turns out that Latino or Latinx families and Black families get a much smaller return than white families. Why? Because the housing stock itself is a legacy of discrimination over years, over generations. Black rental units rather than home ownership. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about what happens when a particular community gets richer. Well, Black rental units don't get the benefits of mortgage interest deduction. That is, if you own your house, you can deduct the interest on your mortgage from your income. That's a major benefit. But if you don't own your house and you rent, you can't get the mortgage interest deduction. And obviously, we talked about this a moment ago in the Q&A, you don't get the appreciation, the increase in your property values. You don't get the capital gains when your property is resold because you don't own the property. Racial income and wealth gaps, again, show up mostly in wealth. And here's the median income and wealth of Black and white families over time in 2016 dollars. You can see that it is wealth, and wealth primarily for most families tied up with houses. You can see how powerful the legacy of discrimination and segregation has been. And finally, there's the issue of isolation. When you have Black or Latinx communities that are isolated, that are cut off, there are fewer good jobs, there are poorer schools, fewer models of successful upward mobility, there are unhealthy environments, lead poisoning, asthma, gun violence. You have fast food rather than easily available, nutritious food in many of these. We're going to get to some of this later on in the course, but I just wanted to give you context. I wanted to lay the foundation here. It used to be assumed that most racial segregation resulted from personal choices, like white flight. It used to be assumed that Black populations inhabit urban cores, while whites were in the suburbs. It used to be assumed that racial segregation mainly resulted from differences in income and wealth. Well, all of these assumptions have been proven wrong. Much geographical racial segregation is, as we've seen, the legacy of laws and regulations. And segregation is not just white suburbs and urban ethnic or people of color. Segregation occurs within cities and within suburbs. And geographic racial segregation contributes to differences in income and wealth by race. It's not that differences in income and wealth by race actually contribute to and cause the geographic racial segregation. This is not only a matter of data, this is also a matter of social learning. Which gets us to sorting by education. Educational sorting is a big deal. Now, just to make sure you know where we are, we're talking about something that I call, and in your readings, we're calling the sorting mechanism. How is it that people sort themselves out by class and often by race, and the sorting that is done is enforced by laws and regulations? Well, let me ask you, where would you like to live after graduating? Now, let's assume it's the United States. Would you like to be in the Bay Area, A, or Greater Los Angeles, San Diego, B, New York, Washington, D.C., C, D, Seattle, Portland, Chicago, Atlanta, Boston, or E, Fresno, Modesto, Cleveland, Cedar Rapids, and Buffalo? Go. 36% of you say the Bay Area. 22% want to be in the Greater Los Angeles area. And 28% of you want New York or Washington or Boston. D, 11% Seattle, Portland. Oh, and Boston is in D, sorry. But only, 2% of you want to be in Fresno, Modesto, Cleveland, Cedar Rapids, and Buffalo. Well, let me just say to you that you're not all that different from a lot of other graduates of prestigious universities in America. A lot of them want to be in the Bay Area, Greater Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C. Some will go to Seattle, Portland, Chicago, Atlanta, Boston, but they don't want to be in Fresno, Modesto, Cleveland, Cedar Rapids, or Buffalo, or cities like them. This is another example of sorting. Because you see, if you graduate from a prestigious university, socioeconomically, you have more choice of where to live. And when you choose the Bay Area or Greater Los Angeles or New York, what are you doing? You're creating more of an agglomeration of people who are like you. You're driving up housing costs. You're creating more gentrification. And you are making places like Fresno, Modesto, Cleveland, Cedar Rapids, and Buffalo, by comparison, in terms of the quality of life, the amenities, the schools, and everything else, even poorer. By metro area, the percentage of college graduates among millennials, these are people ages 25 to 34, you can see that the percentage of college graduates among millennials, well, the big ones, again, what is that? The Bay Area, over 45%, or Boston, New York, Washington, and a few other places. But the percentage of college graduates in Modesto or in South Texas, much, it's fewer. And this is increasing. That is, the differences in terms of the number of people who are college graduates and the differences that that creates in terms of economic potential, those differences are growing, increasing sorting by education. In 1970, for example, 12% of US adults had a college degree, and they were in every major metropolitan area. Now 40% of US adults have college degrees, and they're concentrated in San Francisco, Boston, New York, Washington, Chicago, Denver, and smaller college towns, but they are not in Buffalo or Modesto, generally speaking. We are sorting by education. It has enormous consequences for, again, who is surrounding you? What is the local tax base like? What are the social costs and social benefits of living in a particular area? By the way, what's the most unequal city in the Bay Area, other than San Francisco? I mean, we know San Francisco is wildly unequal, but is it Oakland, Palo Alto, or Berkeley, or Richmond? What do you think is the most unequal city in the Bay Area? Go. Well, some of you think it's Oakland, about 33%, and 36% say Palo Alto, and then we have a few who say Richmond, and then 22% of you say Berkeley. Well, the fact of the matter is, the most unequal in terms of the rich being very rich and the poor being very poor is Berkeley, where we are now. Why is that? Why do you suppose Berkeley, I'm putting San Francisco aside, why is Berkeley the most unequal? What do you think? Put up your hand. Let me have your response, please. I'm just interested in knowing what you think.
I'm going to guess it's because of college students and landlords.
College students are, you say college students are landlords or college students and landlords?
Because, landlords agglomerating most of the properties, and then students constantly cycling through.
Oh, I see. So you're, let me just translate as I understand it. You're saying your theory is Berkeley is so unequal because there are so many people, there's a premium placed on land, on having a place to live that you could turn over and make a rental unit or make rental units for Berkeley students. And so that means fewer places for uh, poorer people to live. Okay, well, that's a good theory. Actually, the data show that unlike these other places, Berkeley does have very wealthy people, and most of them are located in the Berkeley Hills. And Berkeley also has very poor people, not just people who are homeless, but people who are living in West Berkeley and Southwest Berkeley. And the reason Berkeley has so much wealth and so much poverty is, number one, a lot of wealthy people like to live in a college town. A lot of wealthy people, they like the views from the hills. They like the amenities of a college town. They like to attend classes, for example. Hello. They also like the cafes and everything else, like college students do. But one other thing is that Berkeley has done an extraordinary job keeping poor people. In other words, among all of the Bay Area towns that are rich towns, Berkeley has invested more in low-income housing and made its schools, public schools, good enough that the poor can get a decent education and the rich don't run away. Now, there is still a huge lack, a huge dearth of adequate housing, affordable housing, obviously. But Berkeley is to be credited. In other words, when every other place is becoming either very rich or very poor, Berkeley is one of the few cities that's managed to keep both the rich and the poor and the middle class here. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in some ways, having this kind of inequality is a good thing. We were talking before about being in an interesting place, being in a place that has more variety, more diversity. Educational sorting by mate. What's the likelihood you will eventually marry someone with your same level of education? And by the way, let me just emphasize to you that you are a college graduate or will be a college graduate from a very prestigious institution, and your future earnings are likely to be relatively high because of your education. And if you marry somebody who is also going to have a university education, a prestigious one, your family earnings are going to be double. In other words, educational sorting accentuates, exacerbates, increases differences of inequality, differences in income and other sorts of inequality. So is it 90% likelihood you'll eventually marry somebody with your same level of education? 60%, 30%, 10%? What do you think? Go. Well, most of you, 58% of you, think it's 90% likelihood that you're going to marry somebody with your same level of education. Wow. And then 34% of you say 60%, and then almost none of you think it's 30% or 10%. That's interesting. This is, again, a way in which a society like ours sorts itself. And this sorting by mate is increasing over time. Part of the reason it's increasing over time, and I'll get to the answer in just a minute, part of the reason it's increasing over time is that middle class, we used to have a very, very large middle class in the United States, and middle class people did not have two earners in a typical household. The typical household in the middle class, even lower middle class like I came from, had one earner. And that one earner typically was a man. Not always. But if you have two earners, and if those two earners are going to marry somebody with the same level of education, then you are inadvertently, and I'm not criticizing this, but you are inadvertently aggravating inequality. The actual data show, and this is the latest good data here, comes from about 11 years ago, but I've looked at everything I can find, and it's pretty much on point. It's about 61%. That is, partners with the same level of education, either both with low education levels, or both with high education levels, or both with median education levels. It's about 61%. And you can see here that if the man has a higher educational level than the woman, it's about 30%. That used to be much, much larger. Woman has a higher educational level than man, it's about 9%. But the point is, and the most important point is, that education sorting by mate is a very big and important piece of the story. Which gets us to another, and maybe the final pronoun test. It's not just my neighborhood, it's not just my community, it's not just my family, my husband, my wife. It's also my nation. Who gets into my nation? The reason, again, I'm emphasizing pronouns is because the pronouns really tell you a lot about the values, about laws, about public policies that emerge from those values. And immigration, who gets into my nation, is a huge issue because the identification, because the loyalty, because the connection, because the subsidy, whether it's a direct tax subsidy or it's other kinds of sociological subsidies. Take a look at this. This is indigenous communities' lands taken over time. I mean, if there's any group of people who has standing to talk about and to be critical of immigration, it's Native Americans. Their lands were taken. By the way, are you, just for the sake of, so we know who we are you an American citizen who was born outside the United States? In other words, first generation American, or are you B, an American citizen born in the United States, but at least one of your parents was born outside the United States? In other words, a second generation American? Or C, you don't fit either category? Go. So about, let's say 11% of you were born outside the United States, first generation, and about 50% of you were born in the United States, but at least one of your parents was born outside the country. So that's about, so 61% of you are either born outside the country, first generation, or one of your parents was born outside the country. So you have a direct experience, most of you have a direct experience with what we're talking about here. And some of you, actually, you don't fit into either category, but some of you, if you're not a US citizen, you may be A, temporarily in the United States on a student visa, A, or B, temporarily in the United States on another kind of visa, or C, you have a green card that allows you to permanently live and work in the United States, or D, you're not authorized to be in the US, DACA or other. And again, this is anonymous, but go. Many of you are on student visas, but 30% of you who are not US citizens are not authorized to be here. This issue of you, and many of you were brought to the United States as children. You have, some of you, I know, because I know you have been here your whole lives, but you're not officially authorized to be here. And that pronoun, my nation, and who gets into my nation is presumably a very poignant issue and pronoun with you. And that question of, is and when is the administration going to make it safe for you? And is it going to? And could another administration change the ground rules? Is a matter of fundamentally your future. You can see that the percentage of U.S. first and second generation has varied dramatically. A big turning point happened in 1965. 65. And that was when the Immigration Act was passed, which changed from quotas on nations in terms of the number of people who can come from every nation, proportionate to the number of people from those nations who were already here, to family reunification. The criterion for coming to the United States and as a legal immigrant was family reunification, defined in a variety of ways. But the point was that opened the door to more and more immigrants. And I would say a damn good thing, because the United States is aging very, very rapidly, as is Europe, as is Japan, as I believe soon will China. If you don't have immigration, who is going to be here to produce and buy? The United States, from the beginning, focused on this issue of who gets into my nation. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America that any alien, being a free white person who shall have resided in the United States for 2 years, can become a citizen. This is the second session of Congress. This is 1790, a free white person. Well, the country made it very specific who's capable of saying my nation. Now, there have been a lot of legal actions, and I don't really have time, and you don't have time to get into all of them, but there was in 1882, as many of you know, a Chinese Exclusion Act. There were country quotas. I mentioned already the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965. And we continue to struggle. This is a major struggle in this country. A travel ban in 2016 and 2018. It is highly, I don't even need to tell you, highly politicized. What is the future of immigration? Well, it comes down really in many ways to a basic choice. The poem on the Statue of Liberty was pretty explicit about who is capable of saying my nation, or who gets into my nation. The poet Emma Lazarus, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That was the philosophy, at least the philosophy pronounced in the late 19th century. It is still there on the Statue of Liberty. America was a haven. America was where you could achieve freedom and you could have opportunity. But there's a new philosophy, and this is my poem. Forget your tired and your poor. Give us your richest and highest skilled, yearning to make even more. For $1 million floor, they can buy the golden door. It is now possible to get into the United States if you are rich enough. And there are many people who say, well, we should only open the golden door, open the door to the United States for people who already are wealthy or have already a lot of skill. So which do you think it should be? And let me tell you, just so I play devil's advocate here, the people who say you've got to be rich or highly skilled before you come here, what they argue is we don't want to have to subsidize through our taxes and every other way everybody in the world who wants to come here who is poor and needy. We can't do that. There's no way we can do that. There's just not, we can't afford to do that. It would just wreck the social structure of America. So if we're going to allow people in, they've got to be people who can take care of themselves and add value. The rich, the highest skilled. That would be the argument of B. What do you think? A or B? Go. 63%, you say A, give me your poor. 35%, give us your richest and highest skilled. I might add, by the way, it turns out, we know this empirically, that many of the people who come here who are poor, including, I should add, my great-grandparents, do very well. They add a great deal. They are highly productive. They start companies. They hire people. They actually contribute as much, if not more, than the richest and highest skilled. Why is that? Well, sociologists scratch their heads. They come up with some theories. One theory is that in order to get here, you got to be very ambitious just to get here. And ambition is the key criterion of success. Public sentiment actually is very much pro-immigrant. The public has not always been there. In 1994, only 31% of the country was in favor of immigrants and positive about immigrants. 62% right now say immigrants strengthen the country through hard work and their talents. That's a big difference. I think a lot of that has to do with not only the economy, but also experience with immigrants, with new immigrants. That is, there is a point at which there's a lot of social learning going on. And it also may be, as I alluded to a moment ago, that when you have demographically a nation that is aging as rapidly as the United States is aging, it may be that people are starting to understand we need immigrants. We are immigrants. All of us are descended from immigrants, or at least people who were here. They came here, some of them forcefully, except Native Americans. So let me just summarize for a second. Inequalities of place are widening. We are sorting more by income, race, education, ethnicity, place of birth. Who is us? Who is them? The pronouns are incredibly important. They both shape political choices, and political choices in turn shape boundaries. They shape who gets into where. They shape who is us. They determine whether 7-year-old Vivian can stay in the Orinda schools. The increasing ease of seceding geographically is very powerful, particularly for people who are wealthy, who have the ability to secede into their private gated communities, or into their private schools, or into their private whatevers. Being rich in America today often means not coming across anybody who is not rich. Public functions get privatized because there is not enough public support for the public. There is decreasing geographic mobility, often for poor people. And one of the big factors we will see is these connections to relations and friends who act as a kind of insurance policy, and poor people, they need them. because the social safety nets otherwise are becoming too frayed. The third point is that there is a growing legacy effect of discrimination. And we can see that in the compounding effects of wealth. If you are third or fourth or fifth generation wealth, you've got a lot of wealth. And you've got a lot of that wealth that comes down to you from, not directly, but indirectly through shares of stock and bonds and homes and other assets. If you don't have those legacy advantages, then you are going to be comparatively, substantially poorer. And those legacy advantages or disadvantages in turn have depended on laws and regulations which either created opportunities or cut people off from opportunities. Nothing is in stone. Let me just end our session, our fourth session together, with this note, and it's very important. An explanation is not a justification. Nothing I have pointed out, nothing I have said is inevitable in the future. We can, if we want, if we wish, change the trajectory we are on in every respect. We'll talk more about it in this course. Have a great weekend and a great week. Be safe. See you next week.